Today's lecture is going to be basic botany. And there is so much information about botany that we could share today that it would take days to cover. Days. But we have only 3 hours. And we are going to squeeze as much into that as we possibly can. So we're going to talk about 8 basic rules of botany today. These are rules that I use every day. Somebody brings in a plant for a diagnosis. What's wrong with my plant? I'm using these 8 rules. Somebody will bring in a plant and say, what place should I put this plant in my yard? Where will it grow best? I use these 8 basic rules of botany. If someone wants additional information about how to garden or landscape in the desert, I'm always using these 8 basic rules. My objective today is to start you on the path of being able to diagnose plant problems. That's more common than any other question that I get as a professional horticulturist. What is wrong with my plant? What is killing my plant? Well, sometimes it might be a disease, or maybe there's an insect there, but usually it boils down to other things like soils or climate, or maybe just the way that we are treating that plant in our management styles. So as we study these 8 basic rules of botany, I'm hoping that you'll be able to get a feel for understanding the plant and its relationship to the soil and to the water issues that it affects. So with that, let's get started. A little bit about myself. I have been an extension agent in agriculture since 1981, now 35 years. People ask me all the time, Rick, when are you going to retire? And I tell them, as long as I've got my health and as long as I'm having fun, why retire? And so I am still in place. I have a Bachelor of Science in Biology and a Master's degree in Plant Protection, which means I got to study entomology and weed science and soils and water and all kinds of things. It was a fascinating experience for me, and it was perfect training for what I do today. My main responsibility is horticultural research and education, countywide, and they require me to bring research-based information. And my main area of interest, people find a little weird when they find out about me. My main area of interest is sick plants. If you bring me a healthy plant, I'm bored to tears. Oh, this is very nice. But if you bring me a sick plant, I am absolutely enthralled. And so I don't know, maybe that's a quirk of my nature or a personality deficit or something, I don't know, but I really enjoy working with plants that are sick. What are the learning objectives for the day? Number 1, I want you to be able to tell the difference between monocots, dicots, and conifers. I want you to be able to describe the 3 major life cycles of plants. 3 major life cycles of plants. I want you to be able to describe the function of roots, leaves, and stems. How do they work? How are they built? And what affects them? The 4 growing points in a plant. There are 4 places where a plant grows. Tell why a balance of energy is critical. Don't get scared on that. We're not going to do any major calculus equations in that, but it is important to know this balance of energy issue. And I want you to be able to use what you've learned today in a practical way. So that's what we're going to start and what we're going to accomplish. Rule number 1. The plant kingdom is highly diverse. You say, duh, Rick. I know that. That's pretty simplistic. But the issue is this. Because of the diversity of the plant kingdom, what works for one type of plant isn't necessarily going to work for another. And because of that diversity, we need to have a broad knowledge about across the plant kingdom of how it works. Number two is that because of this diversity, no one disease, no one insect is going to kill every plant in your yard. I know, I've heard that question many times. My mesquite tree, my saguaro tree, and my palm tree are all dying in my yard. What insect is killing them? Or what disease? No, that's not the way it works. Because palm trees and mesquite trees and all of the other trees are so different from each other that one disease or one insect isn't going to attack all of them. That's a very important point. And the first practical take-home message today is when we see a plant going down, getting sick or struggling, don't look for just one thing. Look across the entire growing condition, the environment that that plant is growing in. Most of the plant kingdom is divided into divisions or phyla. That's just the Latin names, and we're not going to spend time on those. Most of those divisions of the plant kingdom are algae or fungi or other types of plants that we don't normally grow algae as a decorative plant in the yard, right? So we don't really worry too much about that. What we're more concerned about is the division of the plant kingdom which is called the flowering plants, plants that produce flowers and have vessels or tubes that conduct fluids up and down the plant. They're the ones that are the showiest. They're the ones that give us the shade. They're the ones that give us the fruit. They're the ones that give us vegetable crops for our salads on the table. And so we focus mainly on these higher plants. Vascular simply means that they have vessels or tubes. Think soda straws inside that plant. Water and nutrients going up, sugar and other energy products from the leaves coming down. And if you can imagine that soda straw image in your mind, you'll begin to understand a lot of the important parts that we have to understand about these plants. So we're going to focus mainly on the conifers and on the flowering plants. Conifers really don't, the pine trees, the arborvitaes, the junipers, they don't really have showy flowers. They don't have pretty red flowers like a rose bush does, or like a bougainvillea, or like citrus. They have a different reproductive style. And, of course, the flowering plants is the biggest group that we deal with. This diversity is both beneficial for the reasons that we've talked about, and it is also a challenge. You think about a human physician. They only have to know one species of animal. A veterinarian is a little bit more complex because they work on several different species of animals. But in the plant kingdom, those of us who are treating and diagnosing plant problems need to understand a lot of different concepts. And we have to know how those plants deal in their environment. That's one of the things that we're going to be doing today. Let's start off by looking at the conifers, the pine trees. They produce their seeds in cones. Here is a bristlecone pine cone, reproductive structure. It's different from all of the other plants that we would grow in our yards. We don't grow bristlecone pines in Pinal County. They're elevation of 12,000 feet. But it's a nice big cone, much bigger than the Aleppo pine cone, and so it's easier to see. But the principle is the same. On these cones, the seeds form down in the base and the bottom of these seed leaves in the cone. In fact, if you run your finger down inside, you can feel the little indentation where the seed developed and eventually fell out from. When it reaches the appropriate time, and some cones are open after fire, and some cones at temperature, and it's all different. Eventually, these seed leaves pop open, and the seeds, which are loose inside, just blow out in the wind. That's how it gets separated out. And all pines, no matter whether it's high elevation pines or low elevation pines, all have that same basic structure. So we need to understand that it produces its seeds in cones, and because of that, we have to treat them differently when we plant pines for propagation, or if we're going to handle them in the yard. Requires some different handling. The leaves are shaped like needles or scales. Yeah, I think we all are familiar with pine needles. And they are generally slower in their growth habits than flowering plants. So if I am going to purchase a home, plant a landscape, and turn that home over for profit in a short period of time, I do not want to plant junipers or pines. They grow very slowly. I'm going to want something that grows a little faster so I can get value in my landscape. Pines, junipers tend to grow slower than the flowering plants. And because of that, they can, pests and diseases sometimes can catch up with them. Growth and development is different in the flowering plants. They have flowering plants have a totally different style of growth. And so we just need to recognize the difference between conifers and the flowering plants. So let's start off by introducing a few terms. This is a cross-section of a pine needle. Cross-section of a pine needle. The interior part of the needle is called the mesophyll. You'll want to remember that term because it'll pop up in some other places as we start talking about plant problems. Meso means middle, phyll means leaf. And so mesophyll simply is the part of the leaf that is between the upper and the lower epidermal layers that keep what's supposed to be in, and what's supposed to be out. Here is the epidermal layer here, outside. Simply a layer of cells that usually have a hard outside structure that give rigidity to the plant tissue, and also at the same time resists the entrance of diseases, and also helps prevent desiccation of the needle and of the leaf in the flowering plants. So we have the epidermal layer, we have the mesophyll. Inside the mesophyll is the vascular system, this system of tubes, soda straws, that help move fluids from one part of the plant to the other. A stoma, or plural is stomata. This simply represents holes that are in the leaf that allow fluids, water, inside the plant to evaporate and move out into the atmosphere. We'll talk more about that process in just a minute. What I really want to focus on is this whole issue of resin canals, because conifers are unique in that they have resin. Everyone is familiar with pine sap. You've been up in the forest and you picked up a piece of lumber and your hands come away sticky, it gets in your hair, on the clothes, and you say, oh no, this stuff I'll never get off. And so you go rub your hand or your clothes, or I'll stop short of saying the hair, and some kind of sand to help try to rub it off, you know. But conifers are typical to have resin in them, and those resin fluids are contained in canals or tubes. And this is important because it's a protection to the plant. It's very important for the protection of the plant. Everyone, I believe, is familiar with the bark beetle issue that we've had in Arizona now for a number of years. We've had a huge explosion in bark beetle populations, the Ips genus of beetle, IPS. And these beetles are very common in the mid and higher elevations of the state. Very common. But the trees have a natural protection. As these beetles bore into the tissue and begin feeding right underneath the bark, if there is sufficient resin in those canals, they will chew through. As they chew through a canal, the resin comes out and encapsulates them, goes around them, and blocks their breathing, and they die, and the tree is protected. But if there is insufficient resin in that tree for one reason or another, then those beetles just absolutely go to town, reproduce quickly, and eventually that tree is dead. When we are in the midst of a drought, there's insufficient water for the trees, and the insects have a heyday. When it's raining, like it is now in the mountains, and there is sufficient water for the trees, the damage is much less, fortunately. Now you say, why does that apply to us here in Pinal County? We are not at 5,000 feet elevation. When it's 120, we wished we were at 5,000 or higher, don't we? But we are in the low desert, and the engraver beetle is not typically a problem for us. Except, we have now found a population of the Ips engraver beetle proliferating in Tucson at about 1,900 feet elevation. How did that happen, you say? Well, the beetle, we hypothesize, was brought down from higher elevations in firewood and stacked up against an Aleppo pine or an Afghanistan pine or a Canary Island pine or whatever, and allowed that population to invade. We said to ourselves, they'll never survive our summers. They have survived our summers. So while we do not have, let me re-emphasize that, we do not have Ips engraver beetles in Pinal County at the lower elevations. We never say never. And so master gardener volunteers, horticulturists who are wanting to be in the know, professionals who work for the nurseries need to be aware that there's always a potential. And if there is any sightings of the entrance or exit holes or the engraver tunnels on pines or junipers, we want to know. We want you to be on the lookout. So, if I live in Payson or Show Low or Flagstaff or on top of Mount Lemmon, and I want to protect my trees from engraver beetles, what should I do? I should irrigate. Exactly right. So, as an example now, I've taught you some scientific principles, and I've given you a practical application of that principle. And now you understand the anatomy of a pine needle and the resin canals and why those are so important and how we can advise individuals to watch for, and if we find that particular problem, solve what could be a huge issue for those who have pines and junipers in their yards. Questions? You're going to see that pattern throughout this course many times. Teach you a scientific principle, give you a practical application. Please.
I don't know if it applies here, but over-irrigating can be a problem as well. So,
Over-irrigating can be a problem as well. That is correct. And when we talk about soils and irrigation, I think it's next week, or if not very soon, we're going to focus on that particular issue. Exactly right. You are right on target. All right. Let's talk about the flowering plants. Flowering plants are also very diverse, maybe even more diverse than the conifers, because we have two major divisions of the flowering plants. Again, flowering plants, or we would call them plants that produce flowers for reproductive structures, for reproductive purposes, are divided up into two groups. One are what we call the monocotyledon plants, which include the palms, the grasses, the sedges, and the dicotyledon plants, which would be like apples, peaches, pears, beans, squash. A cotyledon is the storage structure inside of a seed where the plant stores energy for the baby plant, the embryo in each seed. If we take a bean seed and soak it in water and carefully peel off the outer covering of the seed and carefully split it in two, the seed will split into two equal halves. Those two halves are cotyledons. That's the storage part of the seed. It's where energy is stored to get that little plant going, to keep it going until it gets its roots in the ground and leaves in the air. The cotyledons. So if a plant has two cotyledons, like beans and peas, split pea soup, then we call it a dicotyledon, di meaning two. If it only has one cotyledon, like corn, we call it a monocotyledon, mono meaning one. If you take a corn seed and soak it and peel off the outside covering carefully, you will not be able to split that seed into two equal halves. There's only one there. Monocotyledons and dicotyledons. We even will use such words as monocotyledonous to describe a particular type of plant, or dicotyledonous plants. But most of us just shorten it to monocot, dicot. One of the things that I want you to do today when you go home is to be able to identify the plants that you see, monocot, dicot, monocot, dicot. And when we get through here, giving you the characteristics of the two types, you'll find that it'll be easy to do. In fact, it becomes a game. Monocot, dicot, monocot, dicot, monocot. And you'll be able to, and I don't encourage you to do that while you're driving, okay? Not when you're driving, but when you can focus your attention. So how do we tell the difference between those two? And it's very important to be able to do that, and I'll show you why in a minute. The characteristics of a monocotyledon plant are one that when you do a cross-section of the stem, you find that the vessels, those tubes that conduct water and sugars, are in a bundle. They're clumped together, and they're scattered throughout the stem of the plant. If I take a cross-section of a palm tree, I can feel with my hands those bundles of tubes because they have a thicker cell wall, and because of that, they're stiffer. The tissue around them is a lot thinner walled and dries out easily. When I first cut this piece of wood, it was smooth all the way across. I couldn't feel. But now because the small, thin-walled cells have shrunk, I can feel the prickles of the vascular bundles sticking out from the trunk. So as I pass this around, or as you consider a palm in the section in the future, I want you to be able to feel the differences between this and, say, a dicotyledon plant that I'll show you in just a minute. It's important to understand that the vascular bundles are scattered throughout the trunk of the tree and not just in one particular place. Monocotyledons will have the vascular bundles, those tubes or soda straws, in bundles scattered throughout the stem. They also have their flower parts in groups of threes. 3 petals, 3 sepals, 3 reproductive parts, or multiples of 3. 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18. If I want to identify a particular plant, it's usually not considered good form to walk into somebody's yard and cut through with a saw to see what the bundle structures look like. That's pretty drastic, and they probably would not be too happy with that. So I really can't use that technique to identify a monocot plant. I can look at the flower parts, but it takes time to sit there and count each of the pieces. Now, while that's scientifically appropriate, some people start to wonder about our mentality and our lucidity and our connections to reality when we're looking at this flower and saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They start wondering what we're doing. So I typically don't like to use that technique, even though it is scientifically appropriate. I can also take a seed and, like as I explained before, take the seed coat off and count the cotyledons. But when I do that, it kills the seed, and I can't use that. So the easiest way and the most simple way is to just see where the veins in the leaves are. In monocotyledon plants, palms, grasses, sedges, sweet corn, the veins are all parallel. So if I take out this leaf that I cut off of my iris plant this morning, and I take the leaf and I start peeling it down, it will come off in easy removed parts because the veins are parallel with each other. They're parallel with each other. And we'll compare that with a dicotyledon plant shortly, where we will see that they have a different structure. Here is a palm leaf. I'm not going to pass it around because it's got prickles on the side, and I've already damaged my finger this morning. But if you want to look at it at the break, you'll see that the veins in this palm tree's leaf are all parallel. And I could do the same kind of thing with this leaf as I do with the iris leaf. I can make them so that they can separate out into strips. That's been very valuable over the period of time for humanity, because we often in our past have woven baskets out of monocotyledon plants. Bulrushes in the old world. We even have some of that yucca here in this world, the yuccas and the bear grass. I have a dear friend over on the Tohono O'odham Reservation who oftentimes will build a basket when she needs a little extra spending money and come in and say, "Rick, will you buy my basket?" And of course, I'm becoming quite a connoisseur now of Native American baskets. It's very beautiful work to me. very utilitarian. But very particular she is about the plants. She is very careful in the pieces that she selects to weave her baskets. And she is very careful in how she strips out those sections that she eventually is going to weave together. And it's very useful to them. The ancient American cultures have used weaving of baskets for a long. They don't use a lot of dicotyledon plants. They like those monocotyledon plants because the sections weave together very tight. And it's all because these veins are parallel. So as you're driving, not while you're driving, while you're looking at plants and you see a plant that has parallel veins, you can immediately in your mind say monocot. On the other hand, when we look at dicotyledon plants, we have a different structure. Again, and we take a cross-section of the stem, we will see that the tubes are arranged in circles inside. This is a dicotyledon plant, Chinese pistache, that has a disease in it. The disease is verticillium wilt, which we'll talk about it when we get into diseases. But what I just want you to see today is to feel how smooth that is, and notice that there is a different structure right underneath the bark. You'll see that there are different types of tubes, and so those tubes are arranged in circles, in rings, inside of the plant. Dicotyledon plants have their vessels in rings, in circles inside in the trunk. They have flower parts that are usually 4 or 5, 10, 15, 20. They have 2 cotyledons, as we've previously discussed, and they have net-veined leaves. Their leaf vein are net-like. Here is a canna leaf that I cut out of my garden this morning, and you'll see that the veins are not parallel. They go in different directions. And because of that, it's impossible to split those leaves up into something that can be woven. Here is jojoba, same kind of thing. I want you to look at these veins and see if you can tell that these veins are not parallel. I've also got some lantana, net-leafed, veined, and I even took a terminal off of my citrus tree this morning. And again, there's just no way that those veins are parallel. They're all cross-netted. So when you see a tree, like a mesquite or a citrus or other dicotyledon plants, you can tell them immediately by the netted, veined arrangement of the veins in the leaves. Monocots have parallel veined leaves. Dicotyledons have netted veined leaves. So why is that important? Why am I spending so much time on that today? Well, let's talk about these tubes. We need to talk about these tubes just a little bit before we answer that question. In a dicotyledon plant, such as on your left, you will see that the center part of the stem is a group of cells that are thin-walled that are used for storage of water and other nutrients. Water and nutrients are stored in the pith. And then just outside of the pith is a type of a cell that is called xylem, X-Y-L-E-M. And the xylem tubes conduct water and minerals from the roots out to the leaves. It goes from the roots to the leaves. The phloem, P-H-L-O-E-M, is on the outside in a dicotyledon plant of the what we call the cambium layer. The cambium layer is a place where growth can occur. It's where cells divide, where stems get bigger, or when branches get thicker. In the cambium layer is a place where growth can occur. Okay. So we said there were 4 places where growth could occur in a plant. What's the first one we've talked about? The cambium layer. Okay. Need to remember cambium layer. On the inside of the cambium layer are water conducting tubes. On the outside of the cambium layer in dicotyledon plants is the sugar conducting tubes. Energy from the leaves down to the roots. Water on the inside, sugar on the outside. In the monocotyledon plants, they are still arranged in that order. Phloem on the outside, xylem on the inside, but they're again in these bundles. And the cambium layer is right between those 2 layers of cells in the bundles, which is how we add more tubes to that bundle. So we have, again, the same structure. We have sugar conducting tubes, the phloem, on the outside in a monocot plant, and the xylem tissue pointed towards the inside of that stem. Always is that way, with a layer of cambium right down the middle. And that stem swells as it adds these tubes and it adds these storage cells. That trunk can get bigger and bigger and bigger. Any questions? Now, why, you say, are we doing that? Let me give you a little bit clearer picture. On the left, is that a monocot or a dicot? Okay, are the bundles scattered? So that makes it a monocot. This is an actual photograph, cross-section of a monocot stem. You can see the small green areas in between the bundles. Those are the storage cells. And then we have the bundles. The xylem is always going to be pointed towards the inside of the stem. The phloem is always on the outside of the stem. In a dicotyledon plant, we have the storage cells still here, but here are the xylem, separated by a little section of cambium and an eyebrow of phloem tissue. So here's the phloem, the cambium, and these big, old, thick-walled cells like water pipes that carry water from the roots up to the top of the stem. Again, in a dicotyledon plant, they're in rings. In monocotyledon plants, they're in bundles. Before I talk about life cycles of plants, let me back up again. Wrong way. Let me give you an opportunity now to diagnose a plant problem. An opportunity to diagnose plant problem. This is a real life situation. It's one of the first situations that I faced when I started as a county extension agent. The town of Florence wanted to beautify Main Street, and they wanted to plant ash trees. Ash trees are monocots or dicots? Do they have parallel veins, or do they have netted veins? Netted veins. So it makes it a dicot. Okay, so now you know the structure of the stem. You know the structure of the stem. They planted these trees along Main Street to beautify. And they were doing very well. They were in a strip of ground along the street, and They had planted grass underneath it, had an irrigation system and everything was working well. They called me one day in my office in Casa Grande and said, we have a problem here. Every single one of our ash trees are dying. Can you come see what the problem is? We don't know whether it's a disease or whether it's an insect. That usually is the first thing they say. We think it's a disease or an insect, when in reality it could be a whole host of other things. So I asked them a few questions over the phone. What's your watering? What's your fertilizer? I couldn't find anything at fault. They were watering appropriately, had the right schedule, they had the right fertilization schedule. Everything should have been perfect, but every one of those trees, they said, was dying. So I went over to Florence, and sure enough, when I got to the site where these trees were growing, they were all wilting down. The leaves were dry brown. The wood was dead. And I could tell from one glance that it was every single tree in that row. Every single tree in that row. So those of you who are familiar with plants are already questioning this in your mind. How can this be? Because the plant kingdom is so diverse, and even there is differences between one tree in the species and another tree in the species. And so diseases and insects should not take out the entire row all at the same time. It usually happens over a period of time. But all of them were dead at the same time and in the same series of symptoms, and probably in the same way. So I had leaves that were wilted and turning brown at the top. The whole canopy. I said to myself, this is a drought symptom. This tree is not getting enough water. So I got down on my hands and knees and I checked the soil inside the grass. And I'll show you how to do that when we talk about soils and water. I checked the soil, I probed the soil, and there was plenty of water in there. If there was anything, it might have been too much water. But when I checked the roots, that wasn't the problem. The roots were not dead, they were still alive. At least somewhat. Okay? So what could be some of the possibilities that I was dealing with there? Number one, I've already found out that they were fertilizing correctly. Number two, I found that there was plenty of water, so they shouldn't have gone into a drought symptom. Number three is that the grass was perfectly healthy. And I said to myself, maybe the grass is taking all the water. But when I probed down below the root zone of the grass, the soil was still moist where those roots of those trees were. So it wasn't a water problem caused by the grass. I said to myself, what in the world? And then it struck me. I figured it out. I knew what the problem was. Has anybody figured out what the problem could possibly be? Think about the structure of a dicotyledon plant. Where are the tubes? Okay, what tubes are on the outside? The tubes that conduct sugars from the leaves to the roots. Absolutely right. So, where are those tubes found? Just underneath the bark. What is a common landscaping tool that we use to control weeds and grass? Lawnmower, yeah, we use the lawnmower, but yeah, well, we don't use trade names in the room. A string trimmer. So that's exactly right. I got down and I pulled that grass back, and there had gashed that trunk of those young trees all the way around. Had cut through the bark, cut through the phloem, and cut through the cambium growth area, which gives the tree its ability to heal itself, down to these thick-walled xylem tubes. And this, of course, is a herbaceous plant. This is a small, this would be like a dandelion plant, very fragile. But if you can imagine in a tree that those xylem tissue is there's a lot of them, and they have thick walls. They're very hard. It makes a perfect anvil for cutting out the weeds around those trees. They had girdled every single one of them to the point where the tree could not heal itself. So why was it giving a drought symptom then? Why was it a drought symptom when it wasn't the water tubes that were cut? What had happened, you see, is when they cut the food tubes, it starved the roots, and they ceased to function and stopped picking up water, and we see a drought symptom manifest. We will talk in the future about diseases of roots that cause the exact same symptom. And what's the first thing we do when we see leaves that are wilting? We put water on them. But in reality, these diseases only flourish in super wet soils. So sometimes adding extra water, where we see a drought symptom, makes things worse. So I'm hoping you begin to see a pattern here that as we work our way through these series of classes, we're going to build on scientific principle on top of scientific principle and give you a big picture so that you're able to function as a plant diagnostician and feel comfortable with what you're doing. So here's the final question before we leave this particular discussion. Am I going to experience string trimmer blight on a palm tree? Why not? Because they're spread out through all. I can use the trunk of a palm tree all day long as an anvil for a string trimmer. Now, I might damage the outside a little bit over a period of time, which is not considered good form in horticultural circles. So most landscapers do not do this. They understand the importance of not doing that. But if I slip with my string trimmer around my apple tree, I could kill that tree. But if I slip with my string trimmer around my palm tree, I don't worry so much. Make sense? Before we take a break, let's talk a little bit about life cycles of plants. There are 3 different types of plants, and it's important to understand that. Number 1, there are plants that live their entire lives in 1 year. The seed germinates, the plant grows, they flower, and they produce seeds in 1 year. We call them annual plants. There are those plants that live for many years. They grow, the seed germinates, they begin growing, and they will grow for several years. We call those perennials. And there are a type of plants that grow in 2 years. Seed germinates, the plant grows, usually forms a low-growing rosette of leaves just on top of the ground, and then on the 2nd year sends up the seed stalk. Think dandelion in lawns. We can control dandelions in lawns by several mechanisms. Number 1, we can get one of these long weed probes, and we can get down on our hands and knees or sit in a chair and with an umbrella and a lemonade in the pocket and just insert and pop those roots and pull them out. Or we can use a linoleum knife, a wooden handle, a hooked beak knife, which is what I like to use, and then cut below the crown of the plant. That kills the plant. Or if we are not really into that labor intensive and we don't mind using chemistry, we can indeed take out a dicotyledon plant like dandelion in a grass lawn without hurting the lawn. We call those selective weed killers. But to be able to do that, I have to know whether a plant is a monocot or a dicot, which is one reason why we're focusing on this. A monocot weed can be killed in a dicotyledon hedge. I can take Bermuda grass out of a euonymus hedge by spraying over the top with fluoxifop methyl, which is a type of weed killer. It's selective for grassy weeds, monocots. Doesn't affect dicots. On the other hand, I can take out a dicotyledon weed from a monocotyledon lawn very easily. But I've got to be able to know what's a monocot and what's a dicot. And then I've got to read the label to make sure I got the right material, because it's not considered good form in horticultural circles to use an herbicide to kill Bermuda grass when in reality it kills broadleaves. Because if I were to spray Bermuda grass with a broadleaf weed killer in a euonymus hedge, the grass would survive and the hedge would die. And that becomes very expensive to the homeowner. And if we are in business, that usually we lose an account. And if we are the homeowner ourselves, we say to ourselves with much chagrin, I really made a mistake and now I have to pay for it. So this concept of knowing monocots and dicots and the life cycles together is very important, because there are annual weeds and there are perennial weeds. And to kill annual weeds is one thing, but to kill perennial weeds is a totally different issue. And that we'll discuss when we have our class on weeds and weed control. But I just wanted to introduce this concept of annuals, perennials, and biennials that is important. So let me just start by saying that the principal function for leaves is to absorb sunlight for the manufacturing of sugars. That's the process of photosynthesis. Sugars are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The hydrogen and much of the oxygen will come from water. Carbon comes from carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. I'll show you in a minute how those get into the plant. But the bottom line important thing to remember is that the energy that plants use to grow is going to come through the life processes that begin with photosynthesis, the energy involved in that. So what we are going to try and do today is to have an understanding that leaves catch that light and have openings that allow water and air to come and go. Water and air to come and go. That's really important. And one of the biggest challenges that we have to correct photosynthesis in a plant is when we cut off too many branches and destroy too many leaves. We see that violation all of the time. By the end of today's class, I hope that you'll see how several of these rules integrate together to help us to understand that point more. So let's start with a cross-section of a leaf here. This is just a standard leaf, a flowering plant leaf. You're familiar with cuticle. We saw that word cuticle earlier when we looked at the pine needles. And a cuticle is simply a waxy layer that helps the epidermis, the layer of cells at the surface of the plant leaf, top and bottom, to keep things out that need to be kept out and keep things in that should be in. You can recognize the cuticle easily by thinking about a citrus leaf that has that glossy, waxy feel. That's the cuticle. It covers and envelops the epidermal layer. We have an upper epidermis and we have a lower epidermis. And we have a cuticle layer on the bottom as well as on the top. Now when we come inside the epidermal layers and we start seeing the mesophyll cells, those cells come in various varieties and in a couple of different structures. The palisade parenchyma cells are cells that are stacked on top of each other and form a column like a log in a fort, like in a palisade. And those cells stacked on top of each other with no spaces between them give that leaf a lot of strength. That leaf has to stand up during wind, during heavy sunlight. It has to stand up to drying, and it has to stand up to heat. And so that it needs a lot of strength, because if a leaf is wilted, hanging down, it's not oriented towards the sun. And the efficiency of that leaf is reduced greatly. But if that leaf is standing up straight, intersecting the sun, and we have equal access to that sun, no shaded areas, but equal access to the sun, then it works more efficiently. So we want that leaf to be standing out straight. And it's that palisade layer full of water that gives it the strength. When that leaf begins to lose water and the cells begin to shrink, is when the leaf begins to wilt, to hang down. Imagine a Ziploc bag. I take a Ziploc plastic bag and I take it over to the sink and I fill it brim full of water and carefully zip it tight. And that bag is full and plump. I can set it on the counter and I can roll it around because it's got a lot of pressure inside pushing out to cause that bag to push out against its the container edge. Same thing in a cell. When it's full of water, that water is pushing out against the cell wall and gives it strength. There's pressure on the wall which causes that cell to be pushed out and strong. If I take that Ziploc bag, unzip it, pour out half the water and re-zip it, then it sits on the counter and gets flat like a pancake. And to roll it around takes a lot of energy. Same kind of things happening inside the cell. When it's short of water, that pressure inside pushing out against the cell wall is greatly lessened, greatly reduced. And because of that, it tends to collapse in on itself and we see the droop of the wilt. And so it is important to maintain this internal pressure to keep the leaf working at its peak efficiency. The word that we use, and I don't have it on the slide, is turgor pressure, T-U-R-G-O-R. If you ever see that in the literature, that's that internal pressure pushing out against the cell wall that gives it rigidity and strength. Underneath the palisade parenchyma layer, and parenchyma is just the name of a different type of a cell. It's kind of like a storage cell. There are several different types of cells. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on cell biology today, but the parenchyma is a storage cell, and the palisade layer is arranged in columns with no spaces in between it. The spongy parenchyma, same kinds of cells, but they're arranged a little bit differently. In between the layers of the cells, there are air pockets, space where there's nothing but air. And those are essential to the plant. They're always on the bottom end because we don't need the strength on the bottom. This bottom part of the leaf has a different function, and that is to aid in the movement of water through the plant. So we have water absorbed by the roots. The roots suck in water and create a pressure that pushes water up the tubes, the xylem tissues. And depending upon the plant, it can push water up the stem so far. And in small, short-growing plants, that may be sufficient. But when we're talking pine trees or redwoods or even mesquite trees, that is insufficient to get water from the ground up the stem, up the trunk, and out to the leaves. We have to keep water in those leaves to keep the pressure, the turgor pressure going, to keep it up. We need to keep those leaves standing out, so we've got to get water out to those leaves continually. And the pressure that roots create by sucking in water and pushing it up the stem is insufficient to get that water all the way out to those leaves at the topmost part of the plant. There's another process that's going on. That is that every time in the process of water moving up the stem, up the tubes, there is a drop of water. For every drop that comes in, there's a drop that has to go out. And what happens is that the water moves across the cell membrane, the cell wall, into these air pockets and evaporates. It goes from a liquid that we find inside the cell to a gas which we find in the air pockets. And because water molecules tend to stick together, you put a drop of water on the table and you try to move it around with a sponge, you'll find that the water tends to spread out in a film. It tends to hold together. The water molecules hold together. That's why water runs down a river, because the molecules electronically are attached together. They tend to hold on to each other, and when one moves, the whole chain moves behind them. Think about the water coming out the tap. It doesn't spray, unless you got a special kind of nozzle, it sprays out. It doesn't spray out in individual drops. It runs out in a stream. When you suck water up a straw, the water tends to hold together. It doesn't come out one molecule at a time, unless there's a problem with your straw. It tends to hold together. When I put a drop of water on the table and put my finger in it, I can gradually, if I slowly move my finger, the water will attach itself, be attracted to my finger, and it will follow my finger in a trail until the attraction of the tabletop is greater than the attraction to my finger, in which case I lose that traction. It pops loose and stays behind as a drop on the table. I think all of us can relate to this characteristic of the water molecule that tends to hold on to its neighbor and pull it like a chain, like a train moving down the track. And that's what's happening in these leaves. As the water comes out of the cell and evaporates, it pulls the next one up to it. And then that next molecule comes through the membrane and evaporates. And so we have this constant movement of water from inside the tubes into these air spaces in the leaves. And that's really, really critical. Because not only do we have the roots pushing water up, but we also have the leaves and the loss of water through the leaves pulling water up. And we can take water from the ground and to the highest tree using those two methods of movement. That's critical. That process is critical because dissolved in the water are the nutrients that the leaves need for building blocks to create the chemistry that they need. So that movement of water just from nutrition alone is absolutely critical. This process of movement of water through the leaf into the air pockets, out through the stomates, or the holes in the bottom of the leaves, is called the process of transpiration. Transpiration. And many of the problems that we encounter in desert plants, why they fail, is because the process of transpiration has failed for one reason or another. Around these stomates, these holes in the leaf, are cells called guard cells. The guard cells are interesting in that when there is plenty of water in the tree or in the plant, those cells get smaller, they shrink. You would think if they were full of water, they would be plump, but they don't. They have an opposite response. When there's plenty of water, they shrink. And when they shrink, they open up that hole and allow oxygen, which is a waste product of photosynthesis, to exit out, and carbon dioxide to go into the plant. That air exchange is very important. Oxygen out, carbon dioxide in. And it all is a function of transpiration, because if the plant runs short of water, these guard cells swell and shut the door. Opposite reaction to what we would think. Guard cells do things their own way. They have their own ability, their own chemistry, their own process. And it's absolutely a fascinating process, but not one that we're going to spend time today on. So this is a typical cross-section of a dicotyledon leaf. This process of transpiration provides water to the plant, as we've just talked about. It is a process by which a plant loses water, primarily through the leaf stomata. A process by which the plant loses water. It has to lose water. Otherwise, we can't pull water and nutrients up into the leaves. So there has to be this chain reaction, this pull. And plants that have insufficient water for transpiration really have problems. Uses about 90% of the water that the roots pick up, about 90%. Now we have high water use plants, like mulberry trees, that 90% of it's using a lot of water to keep itself healthy. Compared with, say, a agave or a mesquite tree, which are low water use plants. Still, 90% of the water is used in transpiration, but it's a much slower process and it uses much less water. Much less water. About 10% is used in the chemical reactions inside the plant, and it also is this transport of minerals, which is key. The amount of water lost from the plant depends on several environmental conditions: temperature, humidity, and wind or air movement. Wind, especially hot, dry wind, blowing along the surfaces of a leaf, tend to grab hold of that water molecule in those air pockets and suck it out, which increases the movement of water. And if the leaf tends to lose water faster than it's picking it up, than it's being replenished, those guard cells swell and shut down and the leaf wilts. Sometimes we see that in the desert with squash plants. We will have them early in the morning, healthy and looking good. The leaves are all straightened out. By the end of the day, they're all limp down. But even if we don't water them at night, if there's plenty of water in the soil, they still do that. But next morning, they're all healthy and happy again. And it's simply that the guard cells swell up and cause that leaf to shut down so it doesn't lose too much water. So air movement is absolutely critical to the amount of water. So if I'm in the middle of a summer and I've got a medium to high water use plant like a citrus tree or an ash tree, and I'm seeing the hot, dry winds blowing through, I'm thinking to myself, I may need to adjust my irrigation schedule just a little bit to compensate. But there are other factors. This issue of temperature and humidity is also very critical. So as we look at relative humidity, the amount of water, vapor in air, it varies from month to month within the year. And from year to year, for that matter. We have hot, dry years, and we'll have a good monsoon year the next year. And that relative humidity in the air is important to the plant and to our management, because the hotter the temperature and the drier the air, the higher the water demand is going to be. In January, when we've got relatively cool temperatures, and we've been getting some of these winter storms that come through, and the relative humidity percentage may be 50% or higher, some it may be close to 90%, it's a lot less demanding than when we are at 120 with 5%, 2%, or sometimes 0% humidity. Why is that, you say? Well, it works on the principle of diffusion. Diffusion is one of those chemical terms that we said we would never ever use again when we walked out of high school chemistry that last day. But all of a sudden, here it comes back to bug us again. I have got to think about that. Yes, we do. The process of diffusion is simply this, that a gas moves from a place of high concentration to low concentration until the two locations are equal. See, some of you are remembering your laws from chemistry. Lynn, thank you very much for understanding. Diffusion is simply the movement of a gas from a place of high concentration to a low concentration. All right, so let me give you an example. My wife, Lexi Lynn, absolutely loves to go out on dates. We have a date night every week. Friday night is date night. And sometimes we have discussions and give and take on what is going to constitute a date night. I, on one hand, absolutely love cheap dates. Lexi Lynn, let's go down to McDonald's tonight and have a hamburger, and then we'll come home for date night. That doesn't fly very often. She would prefer, on the other hand, to dress up nice and go to a nice restaurant. And in the process of dressing up, she has this process that she goes through, one of which is that she has a favorite perfume. And there's usually a little dab here, and I'm not going to go into that, where all that, how many dabs, and because I don't pay much attention to that stuff. But she has a favorite perfume, and it sits up on the cabinet in the master bathroom. You need to know that we, over the years, were blessed with 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls. And one time when we went out on a date night, it was a dress-up night. It wasn't a McDonald's night. And she put on some perfume. Now, who knows what happened, but somehow in the time that we left to the time that we came back, there was a definite aroma of perfume throughout the house. And as soon as we walked in the door, she said, "Who's been in my perfume?" Front door. "Who's been in my perfume?" Christy says, "Not me, Mom." She's probably 12. Craig says, he was 11, I wouldn't be caught dead in that stuff. And on down through the line, Katie and Jeff and Matt. And Dana was a baby at that time, so I couldn't blame Dana, poor Dana. So bottom line is we never found out who was into the perfume. Maybe Lexi Lynn just left it out, the lid open when she left. But anyway, inside that perfume bottle was a liquid perfume that, when the lid was off, started to evaporate. And it was a high concentration in that bottle, so the gas, after it evaporated, diffused out of the high concentration into this huge atmosphere inside the house, and tried to reach an equilibrium of the gas inside the bottle and the gas inside the house. You all know how that's going to turn out. Eventually, that bottle's going to be empty because it never is going to reach an equilibrium, especially with an air conditioning going that's blowing air out the door. So, fortunately, we got back in time that we were able to put the lid back on and stop that process of diffusion. Compare that with what's going on inside the leaf. Inside the leaf, we have these air pockets with almost 100% humidity because the water is evaporating continually, day and night, into those air pockets. And then it is escaping out through those holes into the atmosphere. If I thought the atmosphere inside the home was big, now think about the entire world. Think about the whole world. If we're not even thinking about the whole world, think about all the air that is in Santan Valley alone, and all the plants that we have, and the process of transpiration. There's never going to be equilibrium, especially when there's 0, 2, or 5% humidity. So I've got high temperatures and low humidity, and that plant is desperately trying to keep itself cool through the process of transpiration. Transpiration is its way of cooling. It's like an evaporative cooler. Water coming through a pad and an evaporative cooler tends to cool the air. We blow that inside the house. So transpiration not only moves materials inside the plant, but it also helps keep the plant cool. That's why 90% of the water that a plant picks up it comes out through the holes. It's in a process to cool itself, especially in the summertime. What's the hottest and the driest month of the year? June and July. When do most people tend to go on vacations? I'm going to San Diego, or I'm going to Flagstaff. Or if I'm a winter visitor, I'm leaving in April and coming back in October. Why are my plants dying? What disease or insect? It might be just that they ran short of water, because nobody's there to check the irrigation system, or we forget an irrigation and that plant runs dry, and we lose turgor pressure, so we can't transmit water and nutrients, and we certainly are not cooling it at the most efficient. So June and early July are the times where we see most damage to the plant because of inappropriate irrigation. And it's simply because of this process of transpiration that takes place and the relative humidity that is associated with it. Basically, relative humidity is simply the process by which we are moving, that requires the movement of water within the plant. Within the plant. In January, it's not a big deal. In June, it is a big deal. Rule number 3. At the base of every leaf, there is a bud. Now, a bud is a baby leaf in the making. That's where a point of growth occurs. It occurs in the buds of the plant. There are buds at the terminal. We call them terminal buds. And there are buds in the axils of leaf. Here's the stem, here's the leaf. The axil is right down where the leaf meets the stem. There's a bud there. And sometimes in many plants there will be other buds that won't be there. They'll be in the wood, but they're all latent. They're not ready to move. So we oftentimes see growth that occurs mostly from these buds that are in the axils of the leaves. Each leaf will have one or more bud at the point where the petiole or the leaf stem attaches the leaf to the branch. And we need to also understand that compound leaves are different from simple leaves. A simple leaf would be like an orange leaf attached to the stem. And those orange leaves, being simple leaves, has one blade. Here's the leaf blade here. Here's the petiole. And down where that petiole attaches to the stem, I'm sure you all can see it from the back, there is a little bud. Has a little bud. And each one of those leaves at the base, there is a bud. Each one of those leaves has a bud at the base of the leaf next to the stem. And those buds can regrow. Let's pass that around again. I don't have a mesquite leaf. But if we had a mesquite leaf, we would find that, I'm going to slip over to the whiteboard. There would be a central stem, we call it a rachis in the business, and here is this basic stem. Here is the branch, and along this basic stem there are leaflets that come out My wife is an artist. She teaches art at the high school. She would laugh at my drawings, but that's all right. We have these leaflets that come out from the base, from the rachis, from that central core. And if I look closely at a mesquite leaf, there will never be any buds here. There aren't any buds. Where the bud is down here. Because this is one entire leaf. Compound leaf versus a simple leaf. But the base of every leaf, there is a bud. You can tell a compound leaf because the leaflets won't have buds. Won't have buds. The bud is at the base of the leaf. So we have to understand that these leaflets of compound leaves do not have buds. And I want you as a project to search the different types of plants, look for compound leaves, look for simple leaves, and find the bud. So that's another assignment that I have. You're going to learn you're going to be able to tell the difference between parallel vein plants and netted vein plants, and you're going to learn to find the buds at the base of every leaf. That's very important to us because some problems with plants from frost or from drought will cause those leaves to fall off. Here's a simple leaf here in the slides. Here's the petiole that holds the leaf blade up, and here is the leaf axil with a bud. And at the base of every leaf there is a bud. This is just one of those practical applications. In some plants, the terminal bud, where it stops for the winter, deciduous stop-growing plants like ash trees and apricots and apples, wherever that terminal bud stops for the winter, will create a scar. Terminal bud scar. And you'll see the ridges around the stem. So we can tell the time of when the last winter was. So if January was right here and it's grown this much in October, I can measure the distance between this scar and where the terminal is and determine how much growth I'm getting. Now in landscape plants, it's not a big deal, just as an incident of interest. But if I've got even a landscape tree, if I'm only getting just a little bit of growth when the genetics say I should get a lot more, I can think to myself, what's wrong with this picture? What's causing that? Fruit growers will measure the distance. They want about 16 inches of growth a year. Pecans, apples. And the reason for that is that they don't want a lot of vegetative growth, because if the plant is putting a lot of energy into vegetative growth, we're not putting in the fruit. They want the fruit because that's what they're growing the plant for. If the tree is putting out, say, 4 inches of growth in a year, then they know I've got to do something different. I've got to actually increase my water or my fertilizer applications to encourage more growth. If, on the other hand, I'm getting 24 inches of growth, whoa, I'm putting way too much water and energy into that plant and it's growing instead of producing fruit. So we can tell the health of the plant and its condition simply by watching the growth in a given season. Terminal bud scars. I want to come back before I do balance of energy and talk just a little bit more about these buds. Because here we have a terminal bud. That's a point where it grows. There's a point of growth at the tips of the branch. And there's also growth in the lateral buds or in the axillary buds. So I can get growth from the side of the stem. I get growth at the tip of the stem. I get growth at the side of the stem. From the terminal bud or from the lateral or axillary buds. So far now we have found growth in 3 places in the plant. Number 1 is in the cambium layer. Think cut off the branch and all of a sudden there's a lot of new branches growing up. Comes from the cambium layer. The terminal bud, the tips of branches, from the axils, base of leaves, the lateral buds, and then the next one we'll find will be the tips of roots. So these buds are extremely important. What's the practical take-home application? In January, we oftentimes get a lot of questions after a frost. Typically comes about on citrus. Nobody seems to worry about apples because they're dormant. And mesquites, who cares about mesquites? But my citrus tree is a big deal to me because I want fruit. And I get a frost or a freeze that dips down into the low 20s and it knocks all the leaves off my tree. The question comes in on the phone. Rick, they say, all the leaves have fallen off my lemon tree. Do I need to dig the tree out and start over again? And the answer is, as long as the buds at the base of the leaves are still plump and healthy and moist, don't worry about it. They'll come back. But if the wood itself and the buds are dead, then we could have some problems. Just for your information, lemons and limes are much more susceptible to frost than oranges and tangerines. Grapefruit are in the middle. We typically can see damage in lemons and limes right at 32 degrees, right at freezing. Limes first, then lemons, then, interesting enough, grapefruit at about 29 to 30 degrees. Then oranges are about 26 and tangerines about 24. And sometimes they will graft each one of those varieties on the same tree. They call them cocktail trees. And it makes a really good thermometer one time, because no matter whatever that temperature was, the most susceptible one is going to die. So the lemons and limes die first, and then the grapefruit. So if I see a lemon and a lime and a grapefruit on a cocktail tree dead, and the orange still alive, then I know it was somewhere around 26 degrees when that catastrophic damage took place. Most people don't want their cocktail tree to serve as a thermometer. So the take-home message is that when there is a frost forecast, we have to determine what the varieties that we have on the tree. If I've got a lime on a cocktail tree, or if I have a lime tree and it's forecast for 32 degrees, I better be covering it. But if I've got an orange tree and it's only forecast to be 30 degrees, I'm not quite so nervous. At the base of every tree, of every leaf, there is a bud. This is probably the rule of botany that I use most frequently. There must be a balance of energy between the top of the plant and the bottom of the plant. Key elements of this is that plants store energy in both the roots and in the stems. Now, we don't worry about that for annual plants because they're going to die anyway. But when we're talking about fruit trees, for example, an apple tree, a citrus tree, a pecan tree, we have to understand that the tree stores its energy in the wood, in the trunk and in the branches, as well as in the roots. And typically it will have a balance between the top of the tree and the bottom of the tree. There will be just about as much energy stored in the above ground portion as there is in the below ground portion. And I can violate this rule of botany very easily. If I come back in and I stub back in my pruning, I cut all the major branches off, clear back to the trunk, and it looks like a telephone pole, then I've cut out a lot of the energy that has been stored in that plant, in that wood that I've cut off. And now I've thrown that plant out of balance. I've got more energy in the roots than I do in the top. And the plant tries to compensate by pushing all of the growth it can to restructure, to rebuild that area, to create a storage place for that energy. So I have expended a lot of the root energy to create a top. And eventually it'll come back to balance, especially once we get leaves and start photosynthesizing again. But the net storage in that plant has been greatly reduced. Takes years to build up that energy. Takes years. And it may not be just pruning. It could be lack of water. I was once asked to help renew a pecan orchard that had been abused, not irrigated appropriately. And pecans use a lot of water. And because they had been stressed for water, they had not photosynthesized efficiently. And they had used up a lot of the energy just to stay alive. Very little fruit production. Just to stay alive, they had used up a lot of energy, and you could see it in the amount of growth in the leaves. You could see it in the amount of growth in the stems. You could see it in the size of the canopy. You could see it in the thinness of the canopy. I could see through the canopy from one side of the tree to the other because there were so few leaves. All symptoms of low energy in a plant. So, how do we get it productive again? How do we get it yielding 2 to 3 tons of nuts per year when it's averaging now about 700 to 800 pounds in a good year? How do we get it back up? How do we pay for the water? How do we pay for the nutrients? How do we pay for the labor? How do we pay for the diesel and the tractor? We've got to get that yield back up. It takes a long time to do that because that tree has to have time to photosynthesize and have enough energy above its normal needs that it can store. It takes a long time. And many people feel that, well, I can't pay the water bill today, so I'll turn the water off on my apricot tree or my grape vineyard or whatever. And they find that they can never get that orchard or that vineyard back into productivity because of this balance of energy issue. When you look at a hedge plant, and you can stand and look at say a Texas Ranger plant, and you're looking at it and you can see the ground on the other side through the canopy of the tree, through the canopy of the shrub. That's an indication that there's a balance of energy problem. And why is that? Because we keep pruning it. We keep making it into these little toadstools so they look cute, but we keep cutting off the energy. The plant's saying, I'm trying. Let me photosynthesize. Let me balance out my energy. And every week, we're coming in and shaving off that growth. And that can be a problem. Most of our healthy shrubs, you look and you watch them. The healthier shrubs are those that have enough growth area where they can store the energy, not only in the roots, but in the stems. And you'll find that they're healthier plants. So this balance of energy rule is extremely important in plants. And oftentimes when I am asked to explain an answer that I give relative to plant care, I'm oftentimes quoting this rule. A change in the balance of energy forces a response in the plant. If I cut back heavy, I'm going to get a heavy growth. But on the other side, if something is killing the roots, lack of water, gopher, root disease, nematodes, any of these kinds that are killing the roots, then I'm going to see a response in the top. And I'll be able to figure out. So when I see a problem in the top of the plant, I'm always thinking, what's going wrong down here? I just was reading an article in Georgia Pecan magazine yesterday. The specialist was saying exactly the same thing. We always look up here for the problem when the problem is down here in the roots. We have to think about the roots, but roots are out of sight, out of mind. This response can be both beneficial and harmful. One of the ways that we increase the sweetness of grapefruit, not citrus grapefruit, the berries of table grapes, is by interrupting the flow of energy from the leaves to the roots. We call that girdling. And we have to be real careful with it. But what we do is we take a girdling knife, which is a twin-bladed knife, and then it's linked at the top. So it's an oval, long oval knife, 2 blades linked at the top with a cutting blade. And we will start at usually at the base, maybe up 12, 18 inches from the ground. And we will start a cut. And we will cut all the way around. Now we're just going through the phloem. If I go too deep, I'm going to kill that plant. Just the phloem, I'm cutting through that, and I do it in a spiral around the trunk so that the 2 ends do not meet. So I'm always leaving some phloem tissue, which is right underneath the bark, intact so that the plant can heal itself. But in the process of cutting through that phloem, I'm pushing that sugar that's coming down for storage down in the roots now can't get to the roots. And so it's pushed by the plant someplace else. And the second heaviest draw, the biggest magnet for energy after the roots, is the fruit. So we can actually force the fruit. It has to be at the right time, has to be in the right place, has to be done in the right way, but we can actually increase the sugar, the sweetness of fruit berries. And it's done all the time in vineyards. Yes, please.
Is that what makes the grapes larger too?
No. The grape size, what makes grape berries larger. And we see that all the time with the flames that we plant in our yard. In the store, the flame seedless grapes are big and juicy. In our yards, they may be the tip of our thumb or smaller. Make good raisins, but they don't give us that big berry. The way we solve that problem is by the appropriate use of growth hormones. They will, depending upon the variety of grape, whether it's Perlettes or flame seedless or cardinal or Thompson seedless, whatever the variety is, there's a certain procedure. And what they will do in general is that when the flower cluster emerges and it starts to flower, for example, in Perlettes, they'll take a hairbrush, one of these plastic tonged hairbrushes that we use. They'll just take that and brush the cluster and knock off a certain percentage of the flowers, which gives extra room now between the berries so that they can swell. And then, as those berries begin to swell at the appropriate time, they will come in. Sometimes they use a shatter spray. They'll spray gibberellic acid, which is a normal growth hormone. They'll spray it onto the berries, and it will cause those flowers to abort, fall off. Same kind of process, two different techniques. And then at the appropriate time, they will come in and spray that cluster with gibberellic acid again to size. They call it a sizing spray that will force that berry to get bigger. But the sugaring usually comes from the girdling process. So this balance of energy thing can be really beneficial and really helpful. Or it can be harmful, depending upon what the situation is. There has to be a balance of energy between the top of the plant and the bottom of the plant. If the plant is out of balance, then we're in big trouble. Just want to quickly walk through some of the issues related to roots. They anchor the plant in the soil. They absorb water and nutrients for use in the plant. They store food and energy, and they produce essential compounds that are necessary to the health of the plant. So this root system is extremely important. And we find most of the problems of plants occur in the roots more than they do in the tops of the plants. There are many different types of roots. These are examples of tap roots that we use for food. But we also find, we're also finding that there are other types of roots. These are fibrous roots usually found in grassy plants, but there are also fibrous roots and systems in broadleafs also. It just depends on the type of a plant, whether they got a big tap root or whether they have a fibrous, and some have a combination. Here's the parts of a root. We have the very tip of the root, where the stems that, where the cells that divide occur. We call it a meristem. A meristem is simply a place on the plant where growth occurs. So now we've found the fourth place where growth occurs. One is in the cambium, tips of branches, in the axils of leaves, and at the tips of roots. Tips of roots. Right behind the root cap, which is the area of most division, we find the zone of elongation. That's where the new cells get longer and wider. They are maturing. And where they are expanding in size, now let me orient this correctly. Where they're expanding in size, they are pushing the tip of the root down deeper into the soil. Where the cells are mature and reach their maximum size, no growth occurs. It only occurs at the tips of the roots. And so the roots grow at the very tips, and they are forced into new soil through the elongation of these cells. So here's an example, a drawing of a root. Here's the root cap that is made up of cells that are throwaway cells. When you push a root through the soil, it's like rubbing your hand on sandpaper. And so the root, very tender tips of the roots, they have this protective cap that keeps them from becoming damaged. They're throwaway cells. Then there is the very tip of the root, where these cells now are dividing. They're dividing actively. In the zone of elongation here is where these cells are getting longer and wider. And that's where the growth in this division of the cells is pushing that root tip. That elongation of the root cells is pushing that root tip down deeper into the soil. Above the zone of elongation, up in the zone of maturation, is where we see the root stay static in the soil. It doesn't go any deeper. It's always going to be at that level. And as that root matures, it starts putting out little structures called root hairs. And root hairs are where most of the water and nutrients are absorbed. It doesn't come so much through it can, but it doesn't come through the outside edges of the roots. It's picked up by these root hairs. And when we transplant a plant, whether it's from the nursery or whether we dig it up, can determine whether or not those root hairs, we put a lot of torque on that root ball and we rip those root hairs, it's going to take a lot longer for that plant to adjust to its new place and be able to reach a balance of energy and be able to take hold and start growing. So we need to be real careful with these root hairs. I was asked in June one year to come look at a euonymus plant and that was dying. And when I went over to look at it, it was a 6-foot tall plant. Beautiful plant, but the neighbor was moving and he said, "You can have my plant, come get it." So the guy went and got it, transplanted it. In June, we already know that's the toughest month, don't we? And when I got over there, I asked him how much of a root ball they had. Well, I don't know, something about this size. Here's the size of a plant, a little teeny tiny. What does that say about the balance of energy? And where are the root hairs? And that plant fried within an hour. And yeah, it died. There has to be a balance of energy, and there has to be enough structure, especially in those hot months, to pick up the water and the nutrients that we need. I put this slide up only to show you this picture here. This concept says that roots only will grow into areas where they only grow in the presence of water. They don't seek water. They don't have a brain to go say, "Oh, this is dry soil." They only grow when they are in moist soil. They don't grow into dry soil. And this slide is a picture of a cotton root in a drip irrigated field. Where is the drip emitter? Is there a drip emitter over here? No. Because this root here now did a U-turn. It came out this way, but it says, "Well, I'm not going that way," and turned around and came over to here. Now I want you to translate that in your mind to a drip irrigated tree in your yard. How many emitters are around your tree? And where are the wetted patterns? If I've got a wetted pattern on one side of my tree and nothing on this side, I've got a problem. I may be able to give it enough water, but when the wind blows, I've got a problem. If it blows this direction, okay, I'm okay, this will anchor it in the ground. But if it's blowing this direction, what's going to keep it from toppling over in a windstorm? Do we ever see trees topple in a windstorm? And have we ever looked at the roots? Have we ever looked at the irrigation system? Oftentimes we don't. But we need to pay attention to how these are done. We'll talk more about that when we get to irrigation. Reproduction is a top priority for all plants. We can reproduce plants either asexually by cuttings or division or by grafting, taking a bud off of a desirable plant and grafting it into a desirable rootstock. Or we can start a whole different plant with different genetics by planting a seed that has been developed through fruiting and flowering. Two different styles of plant propagation, but they all fit into this one rule. Every plant is going to put a high priority into creating new seeds and fruit. Whether it's a grass or whether it's an apple, they're going to put a high priority into these flowering structural processes. So you watch a Bermuda grass lawn, especially in the fall, it's quick to put up seed heads. When we have a weed growing in the yard, it's quick to put up flowers and create seeds. When we're growing apple trees, those apples create a huge demand for that plant to take care of those so that the plant wants to reproduce itself. And we need to make sure, if it's a desirable plant, to be able to provide the needs that they have. Just in general, the structures of a flower, the petals, the sepals, which are the structures that cover the bud, protect it. Together that it's what we call the perianth, the flower. Inside that flower, there are male parts and female parts. The female part consists of the ovary and the baby seeds called ovules, a small narrow neck in the structure that keeps insect and dirt out from inside of the plant, and then a ring area that's sticky on top that accepts the pollen from the male parts. The male parts of the flower, on the other hand, are the anthers at the top, which contain the pollen, and the filaments, which hold that anther up close to the area where the female receptive parts are. So the pollen moves from the male parts into the female. The pollen germinates, sends down a pollen tube that goes down through that narrow neck and hooks up with the ovule and transmits the genetic material that allows that seed to mature. If that process fails in some way, the plant will oftentimes abort that flower or the developing fruit. It's a very common question that we get with cucurbit plants. Cucurbits are a family of plants that has a male flower and a female flower on the same plant, but in different locations. Watermelon, squash, cantaloupe, cucumbers are all in that cucurbit family. You have a male flower and a female flower on the same plant, but in different locations. To get the pollen from the male flower to the female flower, there has to be a pollinator, usually insects like bees. Honeybees are very important to the... In fact, you'll drive by a field of cantaloupes or watermelons, and there will often be stacks of beehives out there, which they're using as pollinators. Very commonly, what we'll see in the spring of the year is these winter storms that blow through. And these early season cantaloupes or watermelons, we'll find that sometimes the fruit starts to turn black. Gets about this long, turns black, shrivels up, and falls off. And that freaks out new growers a lot of times. Rick, my squash is turning black and shriveling up and falling off. And I think back to the calendar, and about the time that was a flower needing to be pollinated was when we had a winter storm blow through. And on a day when the winter storm blows through, the bees don't go out. They stick out their antennae and say, whoa, it's cold out here, or it's raining out here, or they'll just stay in the hive and do whatever bees do on rainy days. And the pollinating work doesn't get done, and when that plant realizes that fruit is not pollinated, is not going to produce seeds, because it's trying to produce seeds, doesn't care about the fruit, just trying to get those seeds. When it realizes those seeds are not pollinated, it aborts the fruit and gives that kind of a symptom. So we just tell the growers, be careful and be patient, and the bees will take care of it as long as they're there. So these flowers are very important to the health and the well-being of the plant. There's several different types of flowers that you need to be aware of. There are complete flowers, that is, it has all four of the pieces, the petals and the sepals, the pistils and the stamen. And I didn't explain that stamens are the male parts and pistils are the female, it's the entire structure. So when we look at this flower again, this is the pistillate part of the flower. The female part of the flower is made up of a stigma, which is this ring at the top, the style, which is the narrow neck, and the ovary, which contains the structure that protects the baby seeds. That's the pistil, or the female part of the plant. The male part is composed of the anthers and the filaments, and we call those stamens. So when we look at these different types, we have a flower that has both a male and a female, the petals and the sepals as a complete flower. An incomplete flower, in the literature sometimes when you're reading about plants, it'll say it has an incomplete flower, and you'll be able to tell when it's missing one of these parts. More importantly to us is the concept of the perfect, imperfect flowers. A perfect flower is when it has both the male and the female part. An imperfect flower is one that has only a male or only a female. And in some plants, we have plants that have the male and the female flowers on the same plant but at different locations. And we also have plants that are only male plants and only female plants. So a staminate flower is one that has, a staminate plant is one that has only male flowers, and a pistillate flower is only one that has female. And knowledge of this scientific principle absolutely saved my marriage. Well, that's probably not true. Let's just say that it enhanced the relationship between me and my mother-in-law. Wonderful woman. Wants to grow dates in her yard. She loves dates, but she lives at a 5,000-foot elevation, which is not really conducive to dates. I didn't think she would be able to grow dates in her yard, but she did. And so one day she wanted to have dates, so she found a date that she really liked, ate the fruit, and put the seed in the ground. Makes me nervous because you never know what the genetics are, right? But it grew, and she had this beautiful tree, and it started flowering. And she couldn't figure out why she wasn't getting dates on it. So she called me over. I was over there one time. I went in and I looked at that tree and I said, Mother, I can guarantee you that this palm tree is never going to give you dates. And she kind of got a little frustrated at that, and she said, well, why not? I said, well, you look at those flowers up there. Those are male flowers. This is a male tree, and it will never put on dates because it has no female flowers. So what did I do, she said. I said, well, you go online or find a catalog and find a female tree of the variety that you want, and you order that in and you plant it. Don't put seeds in the ground because you might get another male plant. Order in a female plant, put it in. And she did. And when the first date came off, the first date crop came off, I got one. Just one. And thanks for being able to solve that problem. And how come? Because we knew that there was a difference between a male tree and a female tree. There are others that are the same way besides date palms. Pistachios have male trees and female trees. There are also other plants, like we've mentioned before, that have the flowers on one side, the male and the female flowers on the same plant, but in different locations. A dioecious means two. Di means two, so that's a male on one tree and a female on the other. And a monoecious is where I've got one plant with a male flower and a female. Types of fruit. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, just simply that there are different types of fruit, and in the process of studying those fruits, they all work differently. An aggregate fruit, such as a raspberry, is a single flower that has many ovaries and many seeds in it. And every time you eat a raspberry, you get a lot of seeds, or a strawberry. You recognize that. And then the other one that I want to talk about is the fruit of the fig tree. There are a fruit that has many different ovaries inside a structure. So we have independent flowers inside a fig or in a pineapple. Each one of those bumps is a different flower, multiple flowers. Figs are made up of all of these flowers on the inside. Figs have a challenge in that some of the types of figs, the Smyrna type figs, which we typically don't grow here, are pollinated by a wasp that crawls in through a little hole in the bottom of the fig and pollinates those flowers. And some of the figs that we do grow in America have that little hole in the bottom, like a brown turkey. And instead of wasps getting in there, the dried fruit beetle or other little brown beetles get in there and start walking around and reproducing. And so I do not like to recommend those varieties that have the hole at the bottom, because most people do not like to have protein with their carbohydrates. So the seeds are important because they can create new plants, and I think we're pretty much familiar with that. This is simply a discussion on the various structures of the seeds, the seed coat, the baby seed, and the seed in there is called the embryo, and here is the baby embryo here, the baby root called the radicle, the baby leaves called the plumule. If you open a bean seed, you'll be able to see that baby embryo if you're very careful to watch. Most of the seed contains the energy and the cotyledon that baby needs to get its roots in the ground and its leaves in the air. I think it's important to talk just a little bit about the different germination processes. In a dicotyledon plant that tends to lift its head, it will push up, but it lifts its head up in such a manner. Whereas a monocot, a grass, has a very sharp tip and it pushes up and then opens up. And we oftentimes need to make sure in the germination process that we don't get a really hard crust on the soil at that critical time when it needs to poke through. Otherwise, we may not get a germination in our seeds that we want. We have to keep that soil crust soft so a dicotyledon plant can poke through. It's easier to get a stand of sweet corn than it is to get a stand of, say, lettuce or cauliflower or broccoli from seed. Rule number 6, we've talked about the 4 points where growth can occur: the terminal bud, the lateral buds, the root tips, and the cambium layer. I have a friend who asked me one time about his mulberry tree. There was a branch that was coming out about waist high, and he was trying to mow underneath that tree, and every time he'd go under the tree, he'd bang his head, and he said, when is that tree going to grow up high enough that I won't bang my head? And I said, it's never going to happen, because once that wood is set, it never grows, because the growth occurs at different parts of the plant. And to this day, now 30 years later, that branch is still growing at the same level, and I suspect he's probably still banging his head on that branch. I put this into your notes simply because it gives you all of these parts and pieces now in one resource so that you can see all the parts of the plant together. Number 7, pruning is a method of dwarfing. We can, by pinching off a plant through the bonsai gardening technique, keep a big tree, what normally genetically would be a huge tree, teeny tiny in a small pot. We can do that. Pruning is a method of dwarfing. But where we run into trouble is when we plant a big tree in a teeny tiny space and try to keep it small by pruning. Because there has to be a balance of energy. When we allow that plant to get so tall and have that much energy in its root system and then try to prune it back, we've already seen that that creates a response in the plant where it's back doing its thing again. I'll show you some photographs when we talk about pruning that demonstrate that technology. It's better, just to say today, it's better to get the right size, genetically sized tree and put it in that small space than it is to buy a big tree and try to keep it small in place. Pruning is a method of dwarfing, but it takes a lot of work. Pruning every day. And most people are not going to prune their mesquite tree in their patio every day to keep the branches off the roof, and also from going over the wall into the neighbor's yard. And finally, bud growth is managed by plant chemistry. As a plant is growing, it sends back a chemical signal to the buds behind it saying, I'm here, I'm doing my job, everything's cool, hang tough. But if a deer comes by and nips off the tip of the branch, or if we cut it off, or if it dies back because of drought, then those buds behind, that chemical signal is interrupted, and the buds behind it wake up and start growing. So this chemical plant chemistry, this chemical signal is critical to the plant and allows it the flexibility to come back from injury and to heal itself if we just give it time. So we have talked about the 8 different principles, rules of botany that I use the most often in my discussions. I find that it is very helpful when I'm answering questions and people want to know why they should do a particular step or why not to do something, if I can explain to them the scientific principle behind what we're asking them to do. And as you and I understand these principles better, we will be able to make sound decisions in our gardens. And our plants, our psyches, and our pocketbooks are going to be much happier. I'll be glad to stay afterwards and answer any questions that you have. Lynn?